Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to be able to get up today and to discuss Bill C-69. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to hold up a copy of it. This bill is so thick that the super staplers couldn't even drill a hole through it. They had to put it into two packages in order to make it presentable to us. And the government has decided that after 2 hours of debate that they're actually going to bring in time allocation on this bill, that they need to limit debate on it. And as my colleague just pointed out, it's not a simple bill. It's 400 pages. The index alone is 27 pages, Mr. Speaker. The summary takes 2 of them. We need to spend a little more time discussing this than this government is prepared to let us, because I think, Mr. Speaker, actually this bill is going to have more impact on Canada, and particularly on Western Canada and my area in particular, than the budget today will have. This will take a little bit longer for the effects to show, but it's going to be very damaging to a large part of this country. My colleague just talked about some of the impacts on small communities that this bill will have. But, Mr. Speaker, I believe that as you do in small things, so you will do in large. And so I want to tell you a bit of a story about this government and the way it's approached an environmental issue in my riding. And I think we can probably extrapolate from that how they're going to use this bill across the rest of the country. A few years ago, our government made a decision that we were going to turn the PFRA pastures back in Western Canada, turn them back to the provinces who actually had ownership of the land. The land had been turned over to the federal government in the 1930s when the provinces couldn't manage it, and the federal government had managed it since then. We made a decision to turn it back to either local communities who wanted to buy it or to the provincial government, and that process carried itself out. There's a small pasture in the southwest corner of Saskatchewan called Govenlock, and it was actually federal land. It's been federal land for 100 years, and so the discussion has been about how do we handle this piece of property that's actually federal land. And the decision was made that it was going to be transferred from Agriculture Canada to Environment Canada, and then it would be hopefully managed in a responsible fashion over the coming decades. Our government made a decision that we were going to try to do something a little bit different. So we went to the local community. The Minister's Chief of Staff actually came out there to listen to the local community, to talk to the ranchers and say, look, you folks have been basically managing this property for the last 80 years, 100 years. What is it that you would like to see from the federal government in terms of being able to manage this pasture over the next few decades? The invitation was there for her to come. She came and sat down with the community, had a meeting with them, and talked to the community about what they would like to see. And there was an agreement that the community should benefit from this project. Whatever happened, community should get some benefit out of it. There was an agreement being made. These weren't all formalized at the time, unfortunately, but that the community would have some control over the management of that pasture, that they would actually have some control over the research money that was going to be spent in that pasture. So they could bring people in, university students perhaps in the summertime, they could assign them to go and do research, and the community would actually benefit from people living in the community, from being able to take some of that money that was going to be spent on this project and then to make a benefit from it. And Mr. Speaker, if you want to see it as a unique pilot project, that would have been probably the best way to label that. It was based around cooperation between the government and the local community. It was providing a benefit to the local community, and there was going to be long-term good management, and the government had made a decision that they were going to trust those people who had managed that environment for so long that they could continue to do that in an effective way. We've got a very different situation 2 years after this government was elected, Mr. Speaker. Basically, all element of community control has been thrown out. The government has come by. It's actually interesting because top Environment Canada officials have come out to the community and toured around in a cavalcade of vehicles, but refused to stop and talk to the local people. So they would come out and drive around, take a look at this pasture land, but wouldn't stop and talk to the locals about what they might want to see or what might be the provisions of the future management of this pasture. They basically come back to the community and said, here are the provisions we're laying out for you over the next few decades if you want to have access to this pasture. They've told them the way they think that the ground will be managed, and actually in my part of the world, every time either an environmental organization or the government has come in to take over land that ranchers have managed, they have taken about 30 years usually to learn how to manage it, and interestingly enough, they typically end up managing it the way that the ranchers have in order to be successful. They removed any funding control from the local community. Basically, there's no commitment at all in any fashion to that, and certainly any research that's taken place has been removed from the local community. It'll come out somewhere out of maybe some environmental group that the government favors or a university somewhere, but the local community is not going to benefit from that. And they basically set up a management system where the ranchers are the servants, the slaves, if you want to get it, of government and the way they've dictated to them. The only interest from Environment Canada seems to be in completely controlling the situation rather than cooperating. And so there's been a loss. There's been a big loss to this one small community, this small community of Consol in my riding. Now, Mr. Speaker, if that's how one small community is being approached, can we translate that, extrapolate that into how this bill is going to approach and going to deal with small communities across this country? And I think we can. When we look at Bill C-69, we see there's 400 pages to it. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, it's not so much concerned about improving the environment, I don't think, as it is about basically controlling the economy, controlling the environment, and trying to have this government tell people out there across the rest of this country of how they are going to manage their affairs and the resources in their part of the world. And now we've got time allocation. I think that's the biggest insult that we've seen basically in here in some time. You take a bill that's that thick and you tell people, okay, you've got 2 hours debate, now we're going to slap time allocation on you and we're going to rush this thing through. Clearly, if people begin to read this, they begin to see what the provisions are in there, the government knows that they're going to get concerned. They're getting concerns from both ends of the spectrum. We know that. There's no one that sees that this is adequate, and I think the government, in its usual commitment to mediocrity, probably think that that's okay. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the past, we've had the highest standards in the world regarding energy development. When I drive through my riding and I see the energy development that's going on there, the wells that are being drilled, the environmental standards are extremely high. And I'd invite anybody to come out there if they want to come out and to walk onto one of those well sites and try to find any place where there's been any kind of a spill, any kind of pollution. They would have a very difficult finding that because those standards are high. They've been high in the past as well. We're environmentally responsible, and in the world I live in, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you there's more wildlife now than there's ever been. The air is cleaner than it's ever been, and certainly we believe that we did a good job of managing environmental issues around resource development, and certainly that needs to be continued. I want to talk specifically about the approval process around C-69, because I'm going to run out of time here, Mr. Speaker, but it's just interesting. I just tried to run through this quickly, and it's only one part of the stream. People may get confused, and if they do, it wouldn't be the least bit surprising because it's taken a lot of people a lot of time to even try to figure out what the approval process looks like. Mr. Speaker, there's a pre-planning section to the projects of 180 days. The minister has basically, I've only got 2 minutes left, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if I can even get through this, but minister has discretion to designate how that is going to be proceed. We don't know how limited the minister's discretion is because it's not in the bill. They can extend that process 90 days by the minister before it goes to cabinet. The cabinet can extend that process indefinitely. Then it goes into an impact assessment of 300 days, goes into 2 different streams, a short one and a long one. If the short one is involved, actually with both of them, we don't have any clarity right now about how that's going to be determined. Short ones, agency handles it. All major projects will end up in this long stream of 450-day commitment. There's all life cycle regulatory projects will have to go through that one. It starts, that 450 days starts when a panel is appointed. It doesn't start from the beginning of the application, and it stops when the minister gets the report. But, Mr. Speaker, the short or long can be extended 90 days. The cabinet can extend those timelines indefinitely. The minister has authority to provide or to ask for any information along this whole cycle can almost be done, and then the minister can come back and say, look, we need to have all this new information. You need to basically start over again and then create a whole new process. That's just one small part of one stream of this bill and the approval process that these people have put in place. And as the minister pointed out to us, Mr. Speaker, to wrap up, just half an hour ago he said in here, well, all of these decisions are political decisions. We believe that these decisions should be made based on science, based on whether it's going to impact the environment in the area or not. The government on the other side is clearly saying we want every one of these decisions to be political, and we're happy to manage them. But we know, Mr. Speaker, what will happen, and that is that the economy in my part of the world, economy in Western Canada, is going to be extremely negatively impacted, and it's not going to do anything to protect the environment beyond what has already been done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. L'honorable député de...
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I would like to raise with him, regarding Bill C-69, the assessment process that is put into place. The government wishes to re-establish the public's trust regarding environmental assessments. I would like his opinion regarding the time that was cut short for consultations and the effect that is going to have on various communities. The government says it wishes to reestablish trust and increase transparency, but it is reducing time allocated. And when it comes to public trust, when we read the bill, it's clearly not a trust that we're soliciting here, and I'd like to know what he thinks of that.
I would agree, in particular, with her final statement, which is that this isn't about establishing trust. We don't believe that. Got a diagram we tried to put together of how this process and this impact assessment panel and process carries itself through. Mr. Speaker, it's virtually impossible to work your way through that. So certainly within that, the government is trying to limit time, and yet at the same time, as my colleague mentioned a little bit earlier, they're expanding standing, and they're expanding the standing to anybody who feels that they have any sort of contribution to make at all. It's going to make it impossible. I think the member from Lakeland said if you expand it to everyone, you basically make consultation meaningless. And that's true, and we've seen that in the past where people flood the system. They don't have any intention of actually dealing honestly and fairly with the application process. They just want to try to stop it, and so they try to stop it by bogging it down so that it can't work.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Conservatives as a whole have kind of lost touch with Canadians. They don't quite understand what it is that we're proposing here. You know, today if you want to advance the exportation of energy, and you want to be sensitive to the issues of our environment, that you need to put into place a process that will, in fact, allow you to build that energy export markets abroad. And this is something in which, when we take a look at the legislation, what it is, in good part, is building that social contract, or whatever it is you might want to call it. This government, and my question is based on this government has demonstrated that it understands the Indigenous factor, the environmental factor, and the importance of exporting our energy. We've actually got agreements. Why does the member across the way believe that under our system, we have been successful in getting a pipeline to Tidewaters, whereas the Conservatives under 10 years failed miserably at doing that?
The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, I don't know why he continues to spew these falsehoods. They already addressed them earlier once. It's just ridiculous. I don't know if he's delusional or trying to mislead Canadians deliberately. The reality is they have failed at every point on this file. You talk about losing touch with Canadians. It wasn't us that was dancing and prancing across India last week, right, Mr. Speaker? When you talk about building markets, they failed to do that. They managed to finish up the European Free Trade Agreement because we had that thing 99.9% done, and they almost lost it because of their mismanagement and their incompetence. They turn around, they divide everyone. They divided Indigenous communities across this country because they refused to hold the leaders accountable for the money that's spent and for the transparency that was put in place. We know everywhere that they've gone, they're dividing communities, and they're not they're not keeping the promises that they made. Canadians are well aware of that. If anyone has lost touch with Canadians, it's this government.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, and what the federal Liberals are doing here is replicating exactly what they did in Ontario. And by making it a purely political decision on whether or not a project can go forth, they were actually using the element of their political fortunes, their electoral fortunes in some cases, determine whether or not a project will go through. Given that this entity is going to have the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission folded into it, I'd like to ask the member, what does he see the potential threat is to the nuclear industry should this go ahead?
For Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I talked a little bit about the bureaucratic morass that these people are putting in place in order to try to, I would say, to stop energy approvals. And certainly nuclear, I believe, needs to be an important part of that mix in the future. We don't hear much talk about it from the other benches, of course, but the reality is that at every point in each of these agencies that they're involving here, they're making it more and more difficult for projects to move ahead. My colleagues have talked a little bit earlier about certainty, how investors need to have certainty. And it's almost, well, I think it's deliberate, actually, that the government is creating uncertainty right through the process. They know full well that investors won't come in and invest in Canada, whether it's energy projects, nuclear projects, or other projects across this country.